Hey, and welcome back to another episode of East County Voices. We've got a full house today, so instead of me just saying we got like the what is that, the Brady Bunch, I'll let everybody introduce themselves. Go ahead. We'll start with that one.
You, Don Carlos.
I'm Carlos Aguilar, better known as Carlos Tacos. You guys know me. You guys want to see who these people are. Go ahead. Who wants to go now?
I'll go.
Jump in. I'll go, Miss Patty. Go first.
Miss Patty, mommy, friend, advocate, activist, problem solver.
I'll go next since I was close. Free Will and Franklin here, KPFA producer, host, engineer. Technical director is actually my official title for Full Circle on KPFA. And I'm also a producer and host here with you all on East County Voices. And I'm an activist and organizer here in Antioch and in Contra Costa and in California. And I've traveled throughout the country and even to other countries to share stories of struggle, of perseverance, and of course, of victory. I'll pass it to Mary.
So I'm Mary Letts, and I'm also a community advocate. I've got a whole slew of kids and chickens and dogs. I just like to show up where people are needed. My goal is social justice, not just community, where we are here in Antioch, but nationally and globally. So I also am an organizer. Sarah.
My name is Sarah Blanco, and I've been doing radio for a hot minute in a variety of places, but I'm at KPFA, and I do a show on Friday nights called La Onda Bajita, and I also work with Dennis Bernstein from Flashpoints, which is a nationally syndicated show on KPFA. And now I get to work with East County Voices, and I'll pass it to our guest today.
Yay.
Yeah. So my name is Nolan Cabrera. I'm a full professor at the University of Arizona. I was deeply involved in the movement around Mexican American studies on both a grassroots and now on an academic level. Just produced the book Banned, which we'll be talking about all of the struggles. But yeah, I'm here. Been in Tucson for 17 years. I'm a dad and a semi-professional travieso. So I think that I fit right into this crew.
Thank you very much. Technical Director Frank had to run in here and tell me something. Can you all hear me pretty good? I usually cackle and I'm heck loud in person, but then suddenly on the radio, I'm like all sultry and quiet. So I really want to try to give the professor and author, Dr. Nolan Cabrera, give us all more information with his bio. He's a nationally recognized expert in the areas of racism, anti-racism on college campuses, and also an expert in ethnic studies. He's currently a full professor in the Center for the Study of Higher Education at the University of Arizona. He is on tour with a powerful book titled Banned: The Fight for Mexican American Studies in the Streets and in the Courts. And so Frank and I had the opportunity to actually interview and speak with and engage with Nolan Cabrera. Do you want to be called doctor? Hey, put you on the spot.
No. Okay. So when I need to do that flex, it's when I'm talking to the folks in the ivory tower, when I'm talking to the provost and president, when I'm in court, when I'm doing things like that. When I'm in the community, it's Nolan all the way.
Got you, Nolan. Thank you very much for that. And so the book is titled Banned: The Fight for Mexican American Studies in the Streets and in the Courts. And he's actually on a tour. And I do want to start out by letting people know that if you go to www.speakoutnow.org/booking, you can actually book him. Remind me to cut this out for KPFA. They're going to be like, what? No shame here at East County Voices. We'd love for you to get more speaking engagements.
Appreciate that.
And so, yeah, I think what I'd like to get started with is some of the basics, if you don't mind.
Yes,
Um,
of course.
What is ethnic studies?
Sure. So ethnic studies is one of the most unique as well as cutting edge and innovative forms of education that is out there. So it came out of struggle. It was born out of struggle. It was born out of the demands of the 1960s. And it was a couple of very simple critical analyses. One, that BIPOC peoples were just not centered in the curriculum. So there was constantly this idea of that we're always deferring to dead white men for our knowledge base. At the same time, there's always this idea that you have sort of educational spaces and the community. And this intentionally tried to break them down and say that there is knowledge, there is wisdom within the community. We can turn these into academic enterprises. But again, it's born and continues to be out of struggle for and with the community, because a lot of times what ends up happening is once ethnic studies comes into spaces and becomes part of an institution, it can get institutionalized and it loses its critical edge. It loses its critical analysis. It loses its grassroots orientation. And that's why it's so difficult to maintain, but also why it's so important. And so in many respects, we're going through a renaissance of ethnic studies right now, because while ethnic studies took up in the higher education after the 1960s, it really wasn't a big thing in K-12 education. But slowly but surely, very dedicated educators, especially in the Bay and Tucson and LA, have really been leading the charge. Oh, and also up in Seattle, have really been leading the charge at saying, what is ethnic studies at its core? How do we implement it in the K-12 environment? And what's amazing, and I think we're going to talk about this later on, is that when done effectively, it's actually one of the most important educational innovations in terms of meeting those who are the worst served by the current state of education. That is, low income, BIPOC, first generation, migrant youth are the most beneficial. It's most beneficial to them, and really gets them from, again, if done well, gets them from being pushed out of high school to actually thriving and succeeding in schooling environments.
And I look forward to speaking more about that with the community as well. People's thoughts, whether we grew up with anything even close to ethnic studies, let alone learning actual true history.
Exactly.
Let's start with the basis of this book. You are the co-author of the
Yes.
book. And tell us about the politician. Well, maybe let's not start with the dirty.
No,
right?
let's start with us. Let's start with us.
That's
Yes.
right. Eso. Let's talk about the steam, the power, the ganas behind this book.
There we go. Absolutely. So the core, the crux of the book, and I really have to give credit where credit is due, that the foundation of this book is the community and the teachers and the people who put this program together. And really what they did is they said, look, our school district has been doing horribly by brown kids, which is abysmal because we're right on the US-Mexico border. We're in Tucson Unified School District, which is about a 65, 70%, Mexican American school district. And yet we have these students that are just getting pushed out consistently. And we had the same dialogues in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And folks are like, why don't we try something else? Because remember that Einstein used to say that the definition of insanity is trying the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And you'd hear every decade, well, maybe if we got a remedial program, maybe if we got some extra tutoring. And all that tells the kids is, you are not good enough, you are stupid, you do not belong here. And they just check out. They said, we cannot do any worse than we were already doing. What if we tried Mexican American studies? And it took a lot of grassroots activism and organizing. And actually, the straw that broke the camel's back, I didn't touch on this when we were all up in the Bay together, was that there was a lawsuit threatened because there were area studies there were specific programs designated for African American and Native American students in Tucson Unified, but not Mexican American. And so civil rights activist Jose Angel Gutierrez with a group of community activists threatened a lawsuit against Tucson Unified. And they said, we would be happy to have a Mexican American Studies program. Let's see what happens. And it slowly grew. And I cannot stress how dedicated these teachers were. I've been in colleges of education for the last 20 years, and I've never seen more dedicated teachers. These folks are they're underpaid, they're overworked, and then they're still figuring out ways on the weekends to come together to refine their craft. They're out there in the community, bridging between the community and school, so it's not such an alien area. It's not such a threatening area. It's an engaging. It becomes part of the community, and years and years and years and thousands of hours dedicated to that, and having students say, this was one of the first times I've ever had a teacher genuinely care about me, because that's the crux of it. You have to know where the students are at and what their needs are. Some of the times our students were just malnourished, and that was the reason why they couldn't concentrate in class, which makes sense, because I know that if all of us were on an empty stomach, we wouldn't be sitting here, chatting and laughing. We'd probably get snippy with each other, and that's just natural human nature. But when it comes to kids, we forget about that. So they met the basic needs of these kids, but then made their environments, they made their home communities like this, their laboratories. Where is their structured inequities? How were they created, and what can we do about it? How can you use your education in a way that actually challenges and transforms some of these inequities in our schools? And maybe it doesn't hit you, but it hits your younger brothers or your younger cousins' generation. And that created this program called Mexican American Studies, which at the time in the mid 2000s was the most successful and most robust and most fully developed K-12 ethnic studies program in the entire country.
And that's K-12. That's a big deal. It's hard to find in K-12 from what I've seen. I'd like to take it back even further to the 60s and 70s. If you could talk to us about the fact that we have this ability to have even created that, please.
Of course. So as I said earlier, ethnic studies was born out of struggle. And what I mean by that is that, students and teachers, it's a very famous case where Sal Castro in East LA they kept saying, hey, could we please have more representation? Could we have more brown teachers? Could we have more brown people in the curricula? And they kept saying no, 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 no. And so finally, what ended up happening was that there was only one option left, and that was massive civil disobedience. A school without students is not a school. A teacher without students is not a teacher. You take the students away, you exercise your power. And in many respects, it goes back to what Frederick Douglass said, where if you look at what a people will quietly submit to, you will find the exact level of injustice which will be wrought upon them. And these folks said they understood their silence ended up being complicity, so they had to demonstrate. They had to say, no, we will not accept this. And while the East LA blowouts are the most well-known, they existed everywhere, especially throughout the Southwest. And we had the same thing in Tucson. And it's not just that students walk out, but that there's a list of demands that come with them. Because going back to Frederick Douglass, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will. So you have to have a set of demands. And people keep saying, well, demand is aggressive. Why couldn't it be a negotiation? Because they neglect the first part of the history, where people kept saying, could we please do this? Could we please do this? And it fell on deaf ears consistently. And so there was a need to demonstrate and to disrupt the status quo. And then from that was the development of Mexican American Studies. But what was really fascinating, what's really tough about that is we focus on the struggle part of it. Equally important was the fidelity of implementation. Across the country, when people are putting this together, it's rough. Like, you have this promise, okay, we can meet students' needs by doing this, but it has, a lot of times folks have these simplistic ideas, and it drives me nuts because I talk about this all over the country. They're like, hey, all right, we're going to take out Shakespeare, we're going to put in Sandro Cisneros, and we got ethnic studies. And it doesn't work like that. because it's trying to disrupt the entire paradigm of education and saying that your education in the struggle, in community development, in community uplift is core to what you're doing. And through that, it gives purpose. You're not just memorizing numbers and thoughts and concepts. You're not just taking a chemistry course and saying, oh, this is on the periodic table of elements, this is what lead is. It's like, no, that lead is in our community garden, and I need to be able to sample our community garden to see if there is lead concentration in it, because we're right next to a smelting plant. It's not just that I am reading and learning how to express myself verbally, but that verbalization needs to be enacted at a city council meeting. That's a different way of doing education, but it came out of struggle and demand. And in many respects, it started with the 60s, but unfortunately, we keep forgetting about it. And in many respects, we are now reliving it, because with so much repression, people are organizing on a much greater level now. It goes back to what Michael Franti said, that the harder they strike us, the louder we become, just like the skin on a drum. And that's the beautiful part about youth right now, is they're refusing to be quiet, as well as a lot of people who are associated with ethnic studies and Mexican American studies.
And that brings us, to the firestorm of today. And we look back at all of the markers, right? All of the racism that was there. And we hear the lines, first they come for, and then they come for me. And as I have said these days, that, these are incredibly difficult times. They're almost beyond what I could have imagined, because I think during the first Trump presidency, I did imagine, martial law. I did imagine all that. I just didn't, I don't think I foresaw this, but even though I feel like as advocates, we prepare for this in some ways, as, Mexicans, Chicanas, we prepare for this. We have been the target for some time. A lot of us maybe have not heeded the warning, blinded by all kinds of things. Talk to us about parallels between the markers that we had and now what we're going through.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's go back historically. Whenever the U.S. has needed a scapegoat, brown people have been a very convenient attack. So, you literally had official U.S. policy as Operation Wetback. I mean, that's but the ideological underpinnings of that are that our country is struggling. We need to blame someone, because God forbid that you actually blame the people, the powers that be. God forbid you actually blame the white supremacist capitalist at the top of the structure. Only blame the brown people at the bottom. And we've seen this over and over and over again. And it's one of these things that, when Mexican American studies became a real hotbed issue in 2006, it was because Dolores Huerta, the labor leader, was in Tucson, and she made a comment, because this was when there was the HR 4437 passed through Congress. So it was a massive draconian anti-immigrant bill in 2006. They're like, oh, we're being invaded. The brown scourge is coming through. We have to do this. And that led to the Gran Marcha, the Day Without a Mexican down in LA, and all the spin-offs that came off of it. But Ms. Huerta said, because of their legislative agenda, Republicans hate Latinos. And it's one of those things, like that one phrase was part of what really elevated Mexican American studies to be in the crosshairs. But historically, Sarah, as what you were saying, it's not coincidental that every election cycle, we just so happen to have an immigration crisis when there are Democrats in charge. And it almost seems like that's a manufactured crisis. It almost seems like, wow, why are, again, I live on the US-Mexico border. All of the, even the Fox News and even the Bill Maher's of the world, the middle class white or upper middle class white liberals. Oh my gosh, these open borders, and how can, that Biden's allowing, and all these things. There were no open borders. That's right-wing propaganda that people brought into. Because again, why would there be a border issue only every 2 years? Why is that? Well, because it drives up the white suburban vote if you can make them afraid of brown people. Why is it that for people white folks in Columbus, Ohio, that immigration was one of the top, if not the top issue in the last election? Why is it that for people in Lincoln, Nebraska, why is it that the farther that you get from my area in the border, that the more that the white imagination creates us as a threat? Why is that? Well, because A, we're a racist society. You know, it was ironic that leading up to the Trump presidency #2, that folks were talking about how divisive critical race theory was. Well, Trump getting elected basically proved critical race theory right, that we are a foundationally racist society, and we have to grapple with that on a very, very important level. And in a very real way, brown people, the threat of the brown invasion, how Trump talks about, you know, rapists, drug dealers, and quote unquote bad hombres, like those images, it's not just that he's saying it, it's that people believe it. And then Stephen Miller, that little, trying not to cuss here, is sitting there in his ear continually saying how much of a threat we are. But you know what? If we were really that much of a threat, one of the first places that they would clear out is the brown people in Mar-a-Lago. But they don't do that because they know that our labor is indispensable to keep this community, to keep this country going. But because we don't have as much of a political and economic voice, it's easy to scapegoat us in the same time. So we're both the target and foundational to this long-term political programs. And unfortunately, we don't have enough of our leaders really flexing our collective muscles and saying, no, like we should, you know, we keep kind of bowing the head. Well, you know, maybe if you kind of thought, no, we have massive amounts of political power here, unrealized, because we are afraid. And that's why Lupe Fiasco said that I think that all the silence is worse than all the violence. Fear is such a weak emotion. That's why I despise it. And I understand fear has some productive effects, but when the fear becomes paralyzing, that you cease to speak until it is a safe space. If you only speak when it's safe, you're never going to speak in the important times. And the self-censorship that I'm seeing right now that's endemic in our communities is only allowing for further marginalization and the further violence against our communities in the process.
Thank you for outlining that. And it's sad. I think about, you know, that to think that anybody would just assume that anybody in my family would be all of these terrible things that they have in their imagination, right? That's what it is, really. It's their imagination.
Exactly.
It is really heartbreaking. And then when we talk about the fundamentally racist society, and well, it was, you know, the colonizers decimated the indigenous people, right? And they made that look natural. And I guess they must have at the time. I just don't know how anybody could have, you know, I guess the silence issue, right? Like all the things that you have taken, I just can't imagine what it would have been like to be a woman during that period of time. And also when I think about the kidnapping of all of the slaves, and then it's like, so they kidnapped them and brought them here. And now it's like, well, what can we do? Okay, well, we can send people back, right? That we didn't bring here specifically.
Of course.
Don't look like us. So there's like a horrible, violent cloud already upon the nation. But this hour isn't going to only be about that, right? I do want to touch into the hope that your book brings. If we could start with, you had mentioned that, you know, the what put the Mexican American studies in the crosshairs was the Lotus making that comment about Republicans. Talk to us a little bit now about the dirty, the politicians, the policies, and so we can get into more of the book.
Sure. So the in many respects, I almost feel like I'm in kind of like racist Groundhog Day. Like what we're playing out here, I've seen before, and it starts with you have something that's not well understood. So contemporarily, it could be DEI, Mexican Americans, or critical race theory, things like that. In the mid 2000s, it was Mexican American studies. And then the playbook is you start to fill that in for the masses. You use the bully pulpit of your office to say that this is threatening. It is, we actually had, so we had the first state superintendent of public instruction, Tom Horn, who petitioned to outlaw three times to outlaw the program, or get legislation passed that would allow him to outlaw the program. His successor, John Huppenthal, who was effective at eventually eliminating the program, he ran on a platform, and I'm not joking, this is a verbatim quotation. If elected, I will stop La Raza. Okay, not Raza studies, not Mexican American studies, La Raza. And again, that shows how deeply endemic the anti-brown racism was at that time, and it still is in many respects. Because, like, if you were to say, like, if you were to go to San Francisco and say, you know what, if elected, I will stop Chinese people, or if elected, I will stop Jewish people, that's automatic disqualification right there. But that phrase was enough to get you elected to the next office when the bill was when Mexican American Studies was in the crosshairs. What was effective, though, the most effective thing that Tom Horn did, and this is why it's so scary, is that he passed a bill, HB 2281. Well, he didn't do it. The legislators in the state of Arizona did it, but it was really his behest, where he could withhold 10% of the state funding if there were classes that promoted the overthrow of the U.S. government, were only made for a specific racial or ethnic group, promoted racial or ethnic tension, treated students as representatives of their race instead of as individuals. And the problem is that, how do you interpret any of these? How do you make sense out of them? Because if you have a law, you have to say, okay, if you do this, this is what is a violation of said law. But for the big one that I harp on all the time is how do you identify that courses are made specifically for a racial ethnic group? Because again, you have, yes, the Mexican American Studies classes were about 90% Mexican American. But you know what? A, we're in a 70% Mexican American district. Two, B, they were in most of the Title I districts or Title I schools. So that's where there was even greater proportional representation of brown kids. But three, and most insidious, white kids in a 90% white class taking AP European history on the north side of town, the rich side of town, would never be targeted and said that this is a class made only for that racial ethnic group. It's only when brown kids are learning about their history and are critically empowered to do something about it that it then becomes a quote unquote problem. And what was fascinating about it was that this law, by Tom Horn's own admission, HB 2281, that was passed in 2010, it was created only to eliminate Mexican American studies. He wanted the entire weight of the state for one program. Brown kids being educated was seen as such a threat that he put all of that legislative energy into it. And it got him elected to be the next state attorney general, and it got his successor, John Huppenthal, into his position. And so it's debatable whether or how much these guys really believe this. And I don't really care, because they use the racist and xenophobic rhetoric as a way of both harming my community and advancing themselves. And for me, the impacts, those two impacts are the only things that matter. But in many respects, that is what we're seeing right now, is that Trump rode that wave of anti-immigrant sentiment into the White House. Again, you have Joe Rogan right now saying, I thought Trump was only going to deport criminals, and now he's, deporting Marta, the housekeeper. It's like, yeah, no kidding. He said he was going to do it, Joe. Like, I know Joe Rogan says he's not a smart guy. He's not that dumb. And so I'm saying that, like, it was predictable because they said it. They said it very clearly. And in many respects, that's what we're dealing with now, because in some respects, the playbook for what we're seeing now was created in Tucson in the mid 2000s, early 2010s. And that's why Jon Stewart said, while the states are the laboratories of democracy, Arizona in that time period was the meth lab of democracy. We exported a whole ton of horrible ideas that are extremely, extremely harmful, and they're still doing harm to this day.
And then I definitely want to open it up to community question and discussion, but I think we should get to the book and the Tucson 11.
Oh, yes. So as soon as 2281 passed, the Tucson 11, 10 teachers and one administrator who were part of the Mexican American Studies program filed a lawsuit against the state of Arizona claiming that it violated their First and 14th Amendment rights. Eventually, it was students who became the plaintiffs in the case, and we took it to a federal court. We lost in 2015. Then in 2017, we lost in 2013. It got bumped up, appealed to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And keep in mind, when the Tucson 11 were doing this, it was tough because, again, you have all the resources of the state coming down against you. And the district, Tucson Unified School District, which doesn't have a lot of money, but has a lot more resources than 11 teachers and one local attorney, Richard Martinez, they weren't going to touch this case. And so it fell on the community, on these teachers to do it. So, they were fundraising. They were doing everything they could to try to get this out there. And it was tough because in the beginning, we just didn't have a lot of resources. As the cases developed, that's when my dear friend and colleague and co-author Bob Chang, who runs the Korematsu Center, civil rights oriented law center, previously out of Seattle University and now to UC Irvine, offered the weight of his group pro bono to work with our group, and through that he was able to recruit a lot of different people to come. And once the flag was raised, people flocked to this cause because they realized what the stakes were. And so initially, our first case that we lost, it was just on the surface. You just look at the tenets of 2281 and you can say, yeah, I think that should be constitutional. Like, why would we want classes that promote the overthrow of the US government? Unfortunately, the devil's in the details. It's not a policy document, it's a discursive document. It's trying to say that Mexican American studies is so anti-Western, anti-white that it is inherently threatening to the US. That's what they're trying to do. But the initial Judge Tsushima, he didn't look at that. He just looked at them on the surface. In 2015, it went up to the Ninth Circuit, and then they looked at it and they said, well, we kind of agree with Judge Tsushima's ruling, but there seems to be on its surface a lot of malfeasance as well. That is, that there seems to be other rationales, other purposes, self-serving purposes for political office, and just racist purposes, as expressed by the politicians advocating for this law. And so they kicked it back down to Judge Tsushima to have a bench trial. And at that bench trial, that's when all of the dirt came out. That's when it was clear that, Tom Horn found us out of compliance before the statute went into effect. Obviously, that shows that he had an axe to grind with it, that we were guilty until proven innocent, not the other way around. John Huppenthal was anonymously blogging, saying that MAS equals the modern day KKK, and doing that, but trying to do it anonymously. But someone looked up his IP address and was like, I think this is from the, yeah, exactly.
That would have been something Miss Patty would do.
I love nerds. Nerds of the world are taking over, and I love it. Not all the Silicon Valley bro nerds. I'm talking like the nice nerds, the ones that are dedicated. But my point being that their own actions, the state's actions, coupled with their public statements, showed very clearly in court that there wasn't an educationally legitimate reason to do this. It was motivated out of racial animus as well as partisan political gain. And so in 2017, we actually won this case. And if anybody who knows anything about law, it is really, really hard to prove racism in a court of law. It is extraordinarily hard because the law only sees it as an individual defect, not as like a systemic reality. And so, but we proved it. And there was a permanent injunction put in place. And so in many respects, what we did, there was a grassroots as well as a legal playbook that pushed back against this state-sponsored racism. And as a consequence of it, I think that that's at the very least what is really, it's a little self-aggrandizing for me to say it's inspiring, but god dang it, I'm still loving this, that we freaking beat the state of Arizona. And if we can do that with the Tucson 11, it gives me a lot of hope of what we can do on a national level with the collective efforts that are going on right now.
Absolutely. And Mary has a comment or a question.
I actually have a question, because when you were talking about it being a character defect opposed to something that's just systemic on a larger level, do you think that with everything that's going on, that those laws will have to change, that they'll have to be looked at on a broader spectrum now? No?
No, I don't think so, because right now you have an extremely conservative Supreme Court that has the same theory of racism. That is that the six conservative justices who are on the Supreme Court, they almost uniformly have the exact same theory of what constitutes racism. And sort of like, it'd be like if I looked at our little Brady Bunch, montage up here, and I'd be like, okay, well, Mary, you're a real nice person. You don't have any racism in you. Miss Patty, you're you have a little racism in you. Sarita, I'm sorry. I mean, your name itself is Blanco, so you have a lot of racism in you. No, but that's the way it sounds silly on its face, but that's really how the Supreme Court thinks about it. And so if these cases start going before the Supreme Court, which in some respects I hope that they will, we're going to have a showdown about what does constitute racism, because they're not willing to hear it on a systemic level, because that becomes more of a class action issue. It's only on an individual level. And that's what's really, really frustrating, is that even with critical race theory coming out of law, that law itself has not caught up to that kind of conceptualization of what racism is.
We're talking with Nolan Cabrera. He just wrote the book Banned: The Fight for Mexican American Studies in the Streets and in the Courts. So you can pick that book up at a variety of places. I think it was put out by, was it Cambridge?
Yes, the greatest imperial university ironically puts out this book.
Right there, like that. And then it's got a lot of really cool titles. I mean, I was looking at the chronology and of events in the prologue. And you're also available because you're on tour. So you are available to do speaking events and maybe podcasts, etc.
Of course, absolutely.
Anybody have a comment or question? Franklin.
Hey, thanks, Professor Cabrera, for being here again. And I remember when we spoke last time with Flashpoints, you talked about how the kids were affected in class and what it did to elevate the kids' self-esteem, but not just the kids' self-esteem themselves. It elevated their education, and it brought up the participation in school, less dropouts, less missing class. Talk about what it meant to the kids participating in class instead of just sitting there twiddling their thumbs or doing whatever, but now becoming part of class because they see themselves in it. And then what that did to their grades and raising their education level.
Absolutely. So this is one of the core issues. And I want to preface this by saying that when we started this debate, because I was the statistician on the case. So in when I'm not talking like this, I'm running numbers and looking at beta coefficients and eigenvalues and little asterisks for, when I say I'm uber nerding out, I'm uber nerding out. But it was an incredible honor to be part of the team that really ran the deep statistics on these classes. And we found a couple of really important things, because, and I don't want to say this is the only impact of ethnic studies, but I think it's important to push back, because sort of the dominant ideology around ethnic studies is, well, it makes kids feel good about themselves, but it really is just, they go and they're doing basket weaving, and it's really not going to get them a job in the future, which, by the way, if you've ever done basket weaving, that is really hard to do. So there's like this weird kind of racist, unintentional compliment that goes along with that, but I digress. My point being that in the situation, when you looked at the students on the aggregate, So you could only take Mexican American Studies in Tucson your junior year or your senior year. And so you had a nice point where you could see how students performed before Mexican American Studies and then after Mexican American Studies. And the kids who took it were generally extremely low performing. They averaged about a 2.2 grade point average their freshman year. And then it went down significantly down to a 2.1 grade point average their sophomore year. Now, any educator in the world, any educational scholar in the world will tell you that is a high likelihood that they are going to be pushed out of school. They are probably not going to complete, and they are probably not very engaged in school in the process. After taking Mexican American Studies, in particular, 2 classes, 2 was kind of the sweet spot. So 1 full year of, say, Mexican American Study or English, junior English from a Mexican American Studies perspective. And these students graduated at some of the highest levels of any group in the entire district. In addition to that, there is, every state does, you have state standardized tests. There's a whole group of students who fail initially because you take them their sophomore year, you fail initially. With that group of students who failed their classes, their standardized tests initially, taking 2 Mexican American Studies classes led to a significantly higher likelihood that the students would pass all 3 of their state standardized tests, including their mathematics one. The math one was really important because we didn't have a Jaime Escalante, we didn't have a Stand and Deliver, we didn't have Chicano Studies math, so that begs the question, what's going on here? Because all too often we think of this very simple banking model of education. I put some information in your head, I can extract it out through a test. Did you learn? Did you not? In this respect, it's deeper than that, because that suggests that the students are changing their orientation to school as a whole. And I love the way that the critical theorist Jeff Duncan Andrade out of San Francisco State talks about this, because a lot of times you hear these kids today, they're all on their TikToks and they're all want to be social media influencers, and they have a bad relationship to learning. And he had this brilliant point where he said, I've met, in my thousands of students that I've come across, I have never, ever once met a student with an adverse relationship to learning, but I've met many with an adverse relationship to school. And that is what was so powerful about Mexican American Studies in Tucson. And then also some of the ethnic studies work that has been going out in San Francisco Unified, that in many respects, you're seeing a rise in student achievement, a significant rise, a significant increase in likelihood of things that are important to students graduating from high school, decreases in absenteeism, increases in grade point average, all of these things that are positive, very basic ways of looking at if students are succeeding in school. And yes, there's a significant relationship between Mexican American Studies and these positive outcomes, or ethnic studies in San Francisco Unified, these positive outcomes. And that's in addition to the non-cognitive ones, outcomes, Franklin, that you were alluding to about, increased self-esteem and seeing yourself as, seeing yourself as a scholar and and as an important student and having relevance in your classes. All of those things fit together. But on those very basic levels with the statistics, it's really clear that Mexican American Studies is incredibly important incredibly important for our students. And unfortunately, so much of that potential was lost because of opportunistic politicians who found that they could get a leg up in society and forgot, well, actually, they don't care that the cost of their advancement is on the backs of brown kids and their educational opportunities.
Thank you. Throwing it back to the crew.
Looks like Miss Patty's got something.
Okay, it's a lot. My mind's blown. I'm like, oh, look, more supremacists doing the same shit in another state.
But remember, we won. That's the most important part.
Yes, but it's scary the way they moved to make those things happen, and always around greed and at the cost of students' education. We saw that in Antioch with the LCAP funds. They were hiring their own homies to write propaganda news, to paint this district as a great district, when in fact, really, it's all the same circle of people with their recalls, their political games, their anything to keep people of color down. They had a study sessions for African American history to incorporate it. They kind of sprinkled it, and it happened, and then nothing came of, because the school district, the original people, which times have changed, they're getting better, but the that cancer is still in the district, unfortunately.
Of course.
And then ethnic studies, that's huge. And to see that it's being taught in high school. I didn't learn about ethnic studies until 2021. And a lot of it covered, I love the timeline behind it, but the class itself was called Ethnic Studies. And a lot of African American history. My thesis was on Black history, reparations. So looking back at timelines, and then it's just, everyone needs to know history. Our ethnic studies of how we got to where we were, where we are. But then even like I lost my identity as a Latina Chicana for many years, with like, maybe because I'm a Bay Arean and then going into the military, and then but I'm
well, that's part of the military right there. That's how they do it. That's why you have to shave your head down. You take away your identity. I mean, that's
but I'm
I
happy
get you.
and inspired, inspired just to the deeper roots of how we got to where we are, because this is native land at the end of the day.
Of course it is. Of course it is. But I think one of the big lies, and I'm reading this into what you said. So if I'm misreading this, please correct me. But one of the big lies that we keep hearing in educational spheres is, here is, identify the core historical context that everybody has to know in order to be successful. And in many respects, ethnic studies says, no, that's not the point. We need to know, yes, we need to know broadly about society. And we also need to tell the truth about history, which is ironic because, you have folks now, you can't speak badly about the founding fathers. It's like, didn't George Washington, wasn't he supposed to never tell a lie, and the whole cherry tree and all this stuff, but we're not allowed to talk about him owning slaves? Like, we can only tell a lie about the guy who could only tell the truth. And actually, the thing about the cherry tree ain't even the truth either. But the point being that all of these things are contested knowledge. And unfortunately, we keep thinking about history as, you need to know these facts in order to be successful, in order to have a civically oriented engagement. And I don't, in many respects, ethnic studies does a couple of different things. One, it makes the local very relevant, because a lot of times kids will know on this broad schemes of things, but not actually understand where they're at. I mean, I grew up in Oregon, and we never once explored why Portland is the whitest major metropolitan area in the entire country, because it's not by accident, right? And you walk around Portland and you only have really nice liberal white people, so you don't have overt racists. So how did that happen? Well, there's a history to that. And when you make it specific, you can learn and make sense about it, because you already know what's going on around you. But then at the same time, we're so mechanized to think that you have to have this set standardized curriculum. Hence, your SATs, your AP tests, all these different ones where it's very, very standardized. Unfortunately, that has no relevance to students. I use an example all the time of the phrase "Tippecanoe" in Tyler 2. I can remember that phrase from, I think it was junior year in social studies. I could not tell you what that means, why it was relevant, why it was germane to save my life. But it would be important if I got in jeopardy. But other than that, what does it have to do with anything? And ethnic studies says, no, we can look at our local, or we can look at more contextualized histories and use that as our foundation to understand because really what we want our students to be able to do is historical analysis. And what's beautiful about that is you don't just have essential knowledge. Instead, what you do is you say, here's an analytical approach, and you will never know enough. You will never be at a place where you stop learning. And so even if, and you should be continually examining and trying to understand and reinterpret and growing in the process. Because the second that you stop learning is the second you stop growing as a person. And in many respects, ethnic studies encourages that continual growth, which is why they always talk about, there's always the metaphor of the seeds of the community, the semillas del pueblo, that keep coming up as a result of ethnic studies, because it's not just one and done. It's a continual process of critical analysis, action, and self-reflection. And you keep doing that over, and it becomes an ethic in your life, but also understanding that as I am acting, that whatever I am doing to someone else, I am doing to myself. And it's basically a manifestation of the golden rule. But without that, we are at, it's basically fostering interdependence, whereas so much of our country is fostered on independence. And unfortunately, independence is meant not to care about other people, which is antithetical to the Christian nationalists, because unfortunately, if you say about Jesus, it should be only about our interconnectedness. I mean, what you do unto the least of these, you do unto me. That should be foundational if we're really talking about scripture.
Ooh, mic drop. Interdependence. Before I mute myself, one last thought is that all of this study and the incorporation of understanding our history and timelines and how we got here, it's a part of the healing journey. In order for us to really make these bigger changes, we have to heal. And this is that. So.
Of course, because, and remember what Malcolm X said, you don't stab the knife into someone's back 9 inches, pull it out 6 and call it justice. As a matter of fact, you don't pull it out all the way and call it justice. It's only when you you remove the knife and let the wound heal that justice can actually be realized. And in many respects, we don't allow ourselves to do that. And what's also interesting about this is that in some respects, and this is getting a little philosophical here, but I think it makes sense, that Paulo Freire would talk about how oppression dehumanizes everybody, the oppressed and the oppressor in the process. It dehumanizes all of us. And again, you want a simple example of it, look at Trump and Stephen Miller, some of the most inhumane things, right? But in the process of disrupting this oppression and collective community engagement and radical analysis and transformative activism, we rehumanize all of each other. That doesn't mean we're going to like each other. That's not human. We're going to get on each other's nerves. That's also to be human. But the dehumanization that stems from systemic oppression is critical to that. And what's interesting too is people continually ask, well, what about white ethnic studies? And I write about that all the time as well, because I write about ethnic studies and I write about whiteness. And one of the weird things about it is, if white people were actually engaged meaningfully in their own histories, they would realize that when Columbus discovered America, and sorry for the radio people, I'm using air quotes here, but there was not a thing called whiteness. It was a trick in the 1700s by elite landowners, because they realized that the European peasantry and free black people could overthrow. They didn't have the numbers. They could overthrow the social they could overthrow the social system that was in place. So they started articulating this thing called whiteness, and it said, become white. Lose your Irishness, lose your Italianness, lose your Jewishness, assimilate into whiteness. And the other part of that assimilative process was say that you are necessarily better at the time than indigenous and black folk, and then it extended to Asians and Mexican Americans, etc. And if you want to see how perfect that assimilative process was, ask any of your white friends, what's your racial ethnic background? And they said, well, a quarter Scottish and a fourth Irish and all this stuff. Okay, fine. What is a core, Irish cultural celebration that you hold dear? And once we usually get past things like St. Patrick's Day and Oktoberfest, all the drinking holidays, once you get past all of that, it doesn't mean anything. It's trivia. Whereas, like, if you said, if I said, hey, Señorita, what's great about being Chicana? there's so many. Your eyes like light up. It is like the point being that our white brothers and sisters, their ancestors made a Faustian bargain. They traded who they were for social domination vis-a-vis white supremacy and colonialism. And again, understanding that history through an ethnic studies paradigm does not demonize them. It shows that they are hurting as well. They are suffering as well in a different way. And we can also offer them those roots to be part of this, because again, they are being dehumanized, as they are continually saying that the worst problem in my life are Mexicans. The worst problem in my life are these quote unquote illegals. They're dehumanizing themselves based upon this Faustian bargain that their ancestors made centuries ago. But history isn't destiny. We are informed by history, but we are not programmed by it. And we can deprogram ourselves in the process. We have the ability to do that. But again, it takes all of us in our collective spaces to heal. But it requires us to be brutally honest with each other in the process, because lies will only perpetuate the supremacy that was created upon the lies of whiteness in the process.
Wow. And we are speaking with Nolan Carrera, author of the new book, Banned: The Fight for Mexican American Studies in the Courts and in the Streets. And if you can, I would recommend purchasing the book. We have a couple copies. If you can't, we have one that you can borrow if you're near here, because our identity and also the books that we write are really an important part of our history. And they're an important part of the fabric of who we are and where we want to be, so that we always write down where we've been, where we want to be, and how we will care for those around us. I do want to shamelessly let people know that Nolan, you can visit the website www.speakoutnow.org/booking and check in about having Nolan come speak for you. I don't know, it could be a church, could be an event. Nolan, how can people reach out to you in addition?
So y'all are going to come at me, but just bear with me. So my handle on Twitter and Instagram is at Chicanostocracy. And yeah, I know I thought of the name like 15 years ago, so just give me a break. But actually, Chicanostocracy was meant to say that there's some of us brown folk who have a certain amount of social privileges, and asking the question, what is then our social responsibility to our people? Not saying, well, we are the elite and we should be drinking champagne and having caviar while the rest of us are toiling in the field. So I always have to give that caveat. So it's Twitter's at Chicanostocracy and Instagram is at Chicanostocracy blog, or at Chicanostocracy_blog, or just www.chicanostocracy.com. And so please, drop me a line, engage with it. And like I said, if I can be of service in your locale, and all over the country, I just put in my 4,000th mile on my book tour. And so, I have books will travel. Here we go. And I hope that we can keep getting the word out about, not just specifically about the Mexican American state struggle, but also what that means in terms of prospects and possibilities in the contemporary times when things can look so bleak and hopeless in this very, very, very repressive and tyrannical administration.
Anyone else? Any last thoughts?
I know we're running out of time, but I wanted to ask one last question about more world issues because of our times right now and what's happening in Palestine and Gaza, and what the administration has done to crush the education of what's happening over there by punishing the campuses and the colleges that allow protest, abducting people that speak out. So talk about how ethnic studies relates and compares to a genocide that's happening in Palestine, where the attack on education and spreading awareness is really waking up the world, and they're really stamping down on it at the same time.
Of course. So one of the first things that you want to see is how intertwined Palestine and ethnic studies are. Is that in California you had the model ethnic studies curriculum, and a core part of it was around Palestine, and very opportunistic voices kept crying anti-Semitism, 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 and basically got the core the curriculum that was developed. They got that blocked, and unfortunately, right now, the Trump administration continues to cry anti-Semitism. But let's be clear about this, because I want, and I'm going to thread a very fine needle here, because anti-Semitism is a very important concept. And I don't like people who use this as a way of justifying their own anti-Semitism, okay? Because there is some, if we're honest, if we're truth tellers, that is a part of our community. Doesn't make it more or less, it's just there, and we have to deal with it and address it. But I do not believe in 1 second that any person in the Trump administration meaningfully cares or even knows what constitutes anti-Semitism. It's all that it is a code word meant shut up. And it is a code word that is used to weaponize their own beliefs against people who they dislike. If they really cared about anti-Semitism when they brought the presidents of Penn and Harvard, in front of Congress, if they really cared about that, they wouldn't have done that in the first place. Because you know what? Every time you pull someone to Congress, they can't fight anti-Semitism on their campus. The more that you distract that, and so at the end of the day, they just don't care about that. They really fundamentally don't care. And I love the way, there's a weird plug, but Jon Stewart had an amazing show last night where he and the author he was interviewing, whose name is escaping me, were actually making the argument that under the guise of just this broad sweeping using anti-Semitism inappropriately and weaponizing it as a way of justifying the mass slaughter and genocide of the Palestinian peoples, in a weird way, it makes, because both of them as Jewish people were saying, we still care about the Jewish people in Israel. And it makes the people of Israel less safe, because it's all that it's doing for the people who don't get wiped out. It's only radicalizing them. And radicalizing them in the way that I mean that they could go to extreme measures to do harm and retribution. And unfortunately, we realized this. We did the exact same thing with the Iraq invasion under George W. Bush. With, we're trying to say they were going to find weapons of mass destruction. And no, there were no weapons of mass destruction, rushed into war, and we created a whole generation of radicalized people when we ended up killing about a couple 100,000 civilians in the process. And unfortunately, those are the lessons that we're learning right now. But in many respects, all that's happening right now is because there is no core ideological logic to what is happening right now, except for the grab of power. That's it. And what Trump has figured out very quickly is that saying this is anti-Semitic, and then throwing the weight of the Justice Department, the Department of Education behind these things gets him what he wants. Harvard is folding like a deck of cards, like a house of cards. Columbia already folded, and these are really, really scary times, because Columbia said, yeah, oh, sure, bring in an administrator to kind of oversee, to make sure that no one is speaking well of Palestine right now, that there won't be any protests, that there won't be, and that's overtly threatening and stifling free speech. And that's exactly why in the time, one of my mentors used to say that an idea is only a principle when you exercise it when it's decidedly inconvenient, when it's decidedly risky. And right now are the inconvenient and risky times. And so if we're not exercising our free speech when we face the threat, we don't really believe in the principle of freedom of speech, because we're waiting for it to be too comfortable, too convenient. And all that I remember is going back to the 1960s, that you had people, you literally had kids being killed at Kent State for speaking out, and yet they still spoke. You had kids getting tear gassed at UC Berkeley, but massive protests and massive police repression. You had that throughout the country. And it was never convenient then. It was very risky then, and it's very risky now. But what I love with a lot of the people who came out of that movement, and I was always reminded, Howard Zinn would always ask this question. He would say, there is always an inherent risk to our actions. However, we forget to ask, what is the inherent cost of our inaction? And right now, because people are so pre-complying and silencing ourselves, we forget that that silence is complicity. Complicity in this this looming dictatorship, complicity in the looming genocide, complicity in the rollback of all of our environmental protections, which I'm not trying to rank oppressions, but it's hard to think about colonialism if we don't have a planet in which colonialism exists. You know, we need to think about all of these things as intertwined and interdependent. And in many respects, this is the time. And unfortunately, it's like March of the Penguins right now. We're not all gonna make it. But the alternative is for us to be quiet and silence. And that for me is not an acceptable solution.
That was Nolan L. Cabrera, PhD, professor and author of the book Banned: The Fight for Mexican American Studies in the Streets and in the Courts. Thank you so much for joining us today.
I really appreciate it. Thank you all for having me. Thanks for the questions, and thanks to the folks online who are engaging. And I'm sorry I couldn't get to I only realized the comments were on over there, so
That's okay.
didn't
We
get.
can say a little bit about it. Thank you behind the panel, Nicole Gardner, Gretchen. Thanks for the information. Raina, thank you. And anyone else who's watching who maybe didn't comment or whose comments I can't see. Let me throw it back to Mr. Carlos or Ms. Patti.
All right, we wrapping this up then. All right, that was amazing. I got to thank you again for being on the show. I'm gonna need 2 copies. I'm gonna need a copy for myself of your book, and then over here, and the next time you're out this way, we're gonna have to take a trip to Stockton. We have.
Hell yeah!
Do you know where I'm going with this?
Keep going. I think I have an idea, but keep going. I mean, that's my. I lived in the Bay for a decade, so I'm like.
His
Keep
name
going,
is
sorry.
Mr. Richard Soto, and he has the biggest library, the Chicano library anywhere. It's a 3-story building, and it's over there in Stockton. So we're gonna have to go out there. He's an original Brown Beret too. So
There we go.
You know, so we'll have to take a trip out there, but he definitely has to have one of the copies of your book. So I'm gonna have to get a couple of copies, man.
And then
We'll do that. Just
please go ahead.
I was just gonna say, drop me your address. I'll make sure and get them to you.
All right, thank you. And with that, any closing comments, Sarah, Frank?
It
Ms.
was
Patty,
just, it
anybody?
reminded me, I love these conversations, and I've been doing, public radio for a minute, especially on La Onda Bajita. And I love the men, right? We got to get more of our Latina, our brown women, our LGBTQ folks talking about this particular subject and these types of subjects. So when you're at the museum, invite me too. Let's also invite some of these powerful women and LGBTQ folks.
Right.
Thank you, Nolan,
right.
very much for your time, and I wish you just lots of success, Franklin.
And before we go, I'd like, if Carlos, you could throw up my flyer for the community announcements. I don't know. I don't know if you have it. So there. All right. So on Sunday, August 3rd, Dr. Feroz Sidwa will be in Palo Alto. He's a doctor that worked in Gaza, and he's been speaking about his experiences. He was on Flashpoints today, a show that I helped produce, but I'm not the voice of. So you can go to KPFA archives and go to 5 p.m. and check out the interview with him. I am going to speak with Dr. Feroz Sidwa tomorrow, and you could hear it Friday on KPFA Full Circle. That's Friday at 7 p.m. on KPFA, and that'll be coming on just before La Onda Bajita. And so thanks for sharing that. And if anybody can make it out to Palo Alto, it's a little bit of a drive for us here in Antioch. But Dr. Feroz was a great resource, a great information, and it'd be really great. Check out that interview today, 5 p.m. on KPFA Flashpoints to hear what he did, what he saw while he was in Gaza serving his patients.
Shameless plug. And then on August 8th, myself and Franklin will be on the ship, the Golden Rule, the Veterans for Peace ship, and we will be broadcasting live with Dennis Bernstein from the Golden Rule ship in opposition, I would say, to any further nuclear war, as we remember Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and also in opposition of the nonsense they're talking about in Alcatraz. Looks like Nicole Gardner wants a book too, and so does Terry Barrios. Thanks for listening, everyone.
All right. And thanks for tuning in, everybody. And we'll see you next week. This is every Wednesday, 8 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. This is East County Voices, and want to say good night and thank you all for tuning in, and thank you all for this awesome show tonight.
Shout out to our amazing white people that are fighting for the people.
Peace.
Talking about